Hey everyone, I am here for today's chapters. Today's chapters are chapters 7 through 9. I didn't hear any feedback about the writing prompt, so I am giving you another one today. As usual, there's at least 3 questions. Today we have 4 questions for our chapters, and I'll give them the answers at the end. So a little synopsis about what we've been reading. We learned about the Littles, how they're little people and they live in the Biggs home, but right now the Newcombs are in there because they're on vacation and renting the house. And unfortunately, because the Newcombs aren't caring about how clean the house is, they got mice. Now, there is mice, and Tom and his father came across their first mouse. So, let's read chapter 7 and see if anybody else comes across one. Ready? Chapter 7. Mr. Little and Tom were not the only Littles who fought with mice that day. Uncle Pete and Lucy had a narrow escape in the cellar. They had been burning trash at the hot water heater when 2 mice trapped them. Uncle Pete and Lucy were under the water tank next to the burner, and there was no safe way out. At first, Uncle Pete tried to fight them off with his bow and arrows, but the old bowstring broke with the first shot, and he missed. Luckily, Pete had made 2 torches from burnt matches he found near the heater. He had wrapped rags around the ends of the matchsticks, then dipped them in a puddle of oil near the furnace. When the bowstring broke, Uncle Pete lit the torches. He and Lucy waved them at the mice and frightened them away. Back in the safety of their rooms, Uncle Pete made a new bowstring. He waxed it carefully and strung it on the bow. "Someone's going to get hurt if this keeps up," says Mrs. Little. "When are the Newcombs going to help us?" "Probably never," said Uncle Pete. "Tom has a plan," said Mr. Little. "It's a good plan, and I think it'll work. Tell your idea, Tom." "Well," said Tom, "those Newcombs never see the mice, so they don't bother to set traps, right?" Tom's mother nodded. "Suppose we show them a mouse. Then they'll know, right?" "How do we do that?" said Uncle Pete. "We don't have any mice. Your mouse got away and my bowstring broke." "We don't want them to see a dead mouse anyway," said Mr. Little. "Then what on earth is the boy talking about?" said Uncle Pete. "Get to the point." "Suppose I dressed up like a mouse," said Uncle Tom. "I could run across the kitchen floor right in front of Mrs. Newcomb." "Good heavens," said Uncle Pete. "Is the woman an idiot? Couldn't she tell a fake mouse from a real one?" "If the fake mouse went fast enough," said Mrs. Little, "she might think it was real." "There's only one thing wrong with Tom's plan," said Mr. Little. "I'll do the mouse running. As head of the family, it's my job." "But, Dad, you're too big," said Tom. "I'm just the right size. It won't look right if you do it." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Little. "Do you think so?" "The boy's right," said Uncle Pete. "If you're going to use his plan, let's do it right. He's the perfect size for the job." It was decided. Tom would play the part of the mouse. Mr. Little would go with him to tell him when and where to run. Granny Little set to work making the costume. By the next afternoon, they were ready. Tom was dressed in the costume. He looked quite a bit like a real mouse, even from close up. Granny Little had done her work well. She had sewn on ears and whiskers. Tom used his own tail, of course. His mother oiled and brushed down the hair so it had a shape of a mouse tail. There's Tom in his costume. "Tom, you look a fright," said Mr. Little. That means you look really scary. Uncle Pete came into the room. "Mrs. Newcomb's in the kitchen now," he said. "It's time for you 2 to get moving." Just a minute," said Granny Little. She was on her knees making some last-minute changes. "It was too loose around the ankles. You don't want him to trip, do you?" Lucy stood behind her mother, sneaking looks at Tom. "Mother, doesn't he look awful?" she said. "I want to see myself in the mirror," said Tom. Hold still," said Granny Little. She worked for a moment longer. "There!" She stood up and looked at her work. "Granny, it's wonderful," said Mrs. Little. "It's awful," said Lucy. The family followed Tom as he squeaked and galloped on all fours over to the mirror. Tom, said Mr. Little, this is not a joke. I want you to remember that. I'm practicing, said Tom. The boy is high-spirited, that's all, said Uncle Pete. I was that way myself when I was his age. Mr. Little had to pull his son away from the mirror. Come, Tom, he said. We're wasting time. Mrs. Newcomb may not be in the kitchen for long. All the Littles went with Mr. Little and Tom down the passageway as far as the tin can elevators. Ooh. Stop. Sorry, she's pawing at me. Oh, where was I? All the Littles went with Mr. Little and Tom down the passageway as far as the tin can elevator. Mrs. Little tried to kiss Tom, but the mouse costume covered his head. Instead, she pulled his tail gently. Be careful, Tom. Do just as your father tells you, she says. He'll be all right, said Mr. Little. He knows what to do. We've gone over it and over it. What's all the fuss, said Uncle Pete. They'll be back shortly. Mr. Little and Tom climbed into the tin can. They had rigged up a tin can elevator from an old soup can and bits of string tied together. The elevator dropped slowly out of sight. It's the first time any of the big people have ever seen any of us, said Mrs. Little, and the only real part of Tom they'll see is his tail. Down in the kitchen, Mr. Little hid behind a wastebasket. He got ready to give Tom the signal to go. The tiny man held up his hand, waiting for the right moment. If Mrs. Newcomb was too close, she might step on Tom. But if she weren't facing the right way, she might not see Tom run across the floor. Mr. Little waited. Tom watched his father carefully. Mrs. Newcomb turned towards the wastebasket, where Mr. Little was hiding. Mr. Little's hand dropped. Then Mrs. Newcomb started walking. No, Tom, wait, whispered Mr. Little. Too late. Tom Little came skidding across the kitchen floor just in time to run between Mrs. Newcomb's feet. Mr. Little closed his eyes. Ah! Shouted Mrs. Newcomb. A mouse! There goes Tom. Mr. Little opened his eyes. Tom was safe under the radiator on the other side of the room. Charlie! Shouted Mrs. Newcomb. There's a mouse in the kitchen! Mr. Newcomb came running. This house has mice? Says Mrs. Newcomb. One of them almost jumped on me. Take it easy, Liz, said Mr. Newcomb. He got down on his knees and looked around. Charlie, you must get rid of the mice, said Mrs. Newcomb. I won't live in a house with mice. We'll get rid of them, said Mr. Newcomb. The Biggs must have mousetraps around someplace. Just don't get so excited, Liz. It's only a little mouse. Don't get excited, you say, said Mrs. Newcomb. You should have seen it. It ran right at me. It might have bitten me. It came so close. You think a mouse would bite you? Said Mr. Newcomb. You can't tell, said Mrs. Newcomb. You can never tell what a wild animal like that will do. All right, so for Chapter 7, what was Tom's plan, and did it work? Chapter 8. The Littles were very pleased with the success of Tom's plan. Mr. Little couldn't get over it. I wish you all could have seen Tom, he said. Zip, he went right across the floor. It's a mouse, yelled Mrs. Newcomb. Oh my, it was something to see. He's a little all right, said Uncle Pete. He has that little bravery. I only had a little bravery is right, Uncle Pete. I was kind of scared. All the Littles laughed except Uncle Pete. Tom Little, you ripped this mouse costume, said Granny Little. She was looking at it under a light. I'm sorry, Granny, said Tom. I was going so fast I couldn't stop when I got to the other side of the room. It tore on a nail under the radiator. I'll fix it, said Granny Little. You can wear it next Halloween. I hate mice, said Lucy. Don't wear that thing ever again, please. Granny, you did a wonderful job on the costume, said Mr. Little. But, well, no one really likes it. Do you know what I mean? No sense in wasting all that good work, said Granny Little. She started sewing. "We may need it again." "I'm not leaving my room until the mice are gone." "Can you stop?" said Lucy. "They'll be gone in a few days," said Mr. Little. "You'll see. Everything's going to be all right now." "I say we should give Newcomb a helping hand," said Uncle Pete. He picked up a sword made from Mrs. Big's needles. "On guard!" Uncle Pete leaped forward, waving the sword and stabbing at the air. "Take that and that!" "Oh, goodness, Uncle Pete, do put that thing down," said Mrs. Little. "I hate to see those weapons around." She turned to her husband. "When can we put them back in the chest?" "As soon as the mice are gone," said Mr. Little. "I figure a few days at the most. In the meantime, I want all of you to watch out for the mouse traps. We don't want any accidents now that our troubles are almost over." "Why don't we stay in our rooms for the next few days?" said Mrs. Little. "Then we'll be safe from the traps and the mice." Uncle Pete didn't think so. "We should know what's going on at all times," he said. "Bad business sticking your head in the sand like an ostrich." "Let's look around once a day, then," said Mr. Little. "That should be enough." "I'm going down to the kitchen first thing tomorrow morning," said Uncle Pete. "I want to see those mouse traps with my own eyes." "May I go with Uncle Pete this time?" said Tom. "Lucy doesn't want to go. Do you, Lucy?" "I'm not leaving my room until the mice are gone," said Lucy Little for the second time. So, chapter 8 is done. To keep them all safe, what do the Littles plan on doing until the mice are gone? What do they plan on doing until the mice are gone? All right, last chapter of the day, chapter 9. And then someone needs my attention, apparently. The next morning, Mr. Little was walking back and forth in the Littles' kitchen. Let me get a drink real quick, sorry. Mrs. Little and Lucy sat at the table watching him. Granny Little was sitting at the table too, knitting. Mr. Little kept looking at the clock on the wall. 10 o'clock, and they're still not here. They should have come back a half hour ago. "Who's not here?" said Granny Little. "Uncle Pete and Tom," said Mr. Little. "They went to the kitchen to see if the mousetraps had been set." "What shall we do?" said Mrs. Little. Mr. Little strapped on his sword. "I'm going to find them. They're probably all right, but I can't stand the waiting." "I'd better go with you," said Mrs. Little. "No, I can handle it alone," said Mr. Little. "I want you here with Granny, just in case. Do you think the mice would come here?" "No, but you can't be sure," said Mr. Little. They did in 35. When there is enough of them, they'll try anything. When Mr. Little got to the kitchen, he couldn't find Uncle Pete and Tom. He didn't see any mousetraps either. He went to the cellar. Still no signs of the boy and his uncle. And there were no mousetraps in the cellar. Something's wrong, thought Mr. Little. Mr. Little went to the garbage can. There had to be mousetraps there. It was the best place to catch mice. But there were none. And still no sign of the missing Littles. It's very strange, thought Mr. Little. No mice, no mousetraps, and no Tom or Uncle Pete. He decided to return to the kitchen. That's where Uncle Pete wanted to go in the first place. So Mr. Little turned back and headed for the kitchen. Meanwhile, back at the Littles' rooms, Lucy was thinking about her father. Suppose he needs someone to send a message or something. I should have gone with him. She looked into the living room. Granny Little was sitting in her chair by the fireplace. Lucy's mother was watching the door, a kitchen knife in her lap. I should be with my father, thought Lucy. Then suddenly she made up her mind. She ran to her room and got the bow and arrows. Then she slipped out the back door into the passageway. Mr. Little was in the kitchen under the radiator. He waited until he could hear the Newcombs talking in the living room. Then he felt it was safe to look around. Near the door to the dining room, he came upon Uncle Pete's sword. Uncle Pete would never let go of his sword, he thought, unless it was knocked from his hands. This is bad. I wonder if... He put that thought out of his mind. Don't think. he told himself. Just keep looking. Mr. Little drew his sword. He went into the dining room. He crept close to the wall and walked slowly towards the fireplace. There he goes, creeping. Just as Mr. Little was leaving the kitchen, Lucy got there. She saw her father go into the dining room, sword in hand. Lucy ran to catch up. Her father was only a few feet ahead of her, when suddenly a giant cat leaped at him out of the shadows. Lucy was never so scared in her life. She ran towards the cat. She ran without thinking. The gigantic animal had attacked her father. She would save her father somehow. The tiny girl came up behind the cat. Its long tail... Sorry, I had to stop. The tiny girl came up behind the cat. Its long tail swished back and forth over her head. She took an arrow and jabbed it as hard as she could into the cat's tail. "Yow!" yelled the cat, and it ran out of the dining room, through the hall, and into the living room. Mr. Little was not hurt. He jumped to his feet. At the same time, Uncle Pete and Tom came running out of the fireplace. They had been cornered by the cat and were hiding under the logs. "Let's get out of here!" yelled Mr. Little. He ran for the kitchen. "Not without this," said Uncle Pete. He bent down and scooped up his sword. The four littles dashed under the radiator and through the trap door. So, last two questions. First one, what is the new surprise to the situation that the littles are in? They already have random people living in the house that are dirty, mice, and now there's a new thing they have to deal with. What is it? Second question, how does Lucy save her father? All right. Now, before I give you the answers to those questions, I'm going to give you a little writing prompt, a little stop and think thing that you guys can do together. So, today's kind of is personal in a way. It hits home. The littles decided to stay indoors, only checking on the situation once a day. How is that like our current situation, where we're dealing with this coronavirus and we're trying to keep healthy? What did they do that was the same? What did they do that's different? How is the situation same or different? All right, are you ready for your answers? Question number 1, what is Tom's plan and does it work? So, Tom's plan was to dress as a mouse and scurry across the floor in front of Mrs. Newcomb so they finally see mice. And yes, it worked brilliantly with the help of his family who helped him make a costume and his father who made sure that he went at the right time. Question number 2. To keep them all safe, what is the littles' plan until all the mice are gone? Their plan was to stay in their room and look once a day to check on the current situation. All right, question number 3. What new surprise or new thing has joined the situation? It's a cat. And if you remember at the beginning of the book, Lucy talks about how scared of cats she is. She hates cats. She hopes they never ever have a cat in their lives. Poor Lucy. But how does Lucy save her father? She has bravery and courage, and she runs at the cat and stabs his tail with an arrow. I think there's a picture of it too. I'll show you. I don't know if I showed it to you guys, but here it is. Stabbed him with an arrow. All right, I'm interested to see what you guys think about this book so far and what you're learning. I'm sorry I had to do 2 parts. River started barking at the back door, so I had to get her to stop. Have a great day.